September 99 comes, Dave, and Eric Bischoff is gone. It was a long process. He attempted a relaunch of WCW with a new look and a new logo for Nitro in April. That didn't take. Why ultimately do you think Eric Bischoff exited stage left after all those years?
The company was going down. It was creatively in a bad way, and he was the guy in charge, so he was the guy who got the heat. 1999 was. 2000 was the worst year money-wise, but 1999 was really the year of an amazing collapse in a short period of time. It's almost mind-boggling when you look back at some of the stats. Year to year, there were months where that they dropped like 90% in attendance from the year before.
Wow.
The ratings didn't drop to that degree, but the ratings dropped gigantically, and it's like and they were just getting killed in the wrestling war. Before it was a wrestling war, and by, 90, I would say by the David Arquette period in '99 is when it really just ceased to be anything, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was. I think it's actually we talked about 2000 there.
Okay.
May of 2000 when David Arquette wins the belt.
So that was like the real. Okay, so '99 was the year of the collapse, and then 2000 was the year that it was like playing out the string and everything. Yeah.
Unquestionably, will come October. Some news that shook the wrestling world as Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara jumped from the WWF to WCW. Did it feel like a positive at the time?
Yes, I thought it was a positive at the time. Of course, Vince Russo was really good at selling himself. And they needed something new, because they were just going nowhere. They had no direction, and Vince Russo had, WWF was doing phenomenal business, and Russo took, I always knew that, it was a big team effort, and it was certainly not just Vince Russo. But, the fact is that WWF had done very, very well, and had created new stars and done all the things, they were the hottest that they ever were. They got they still stayed strong for another year or two, but that was like the real rise of WWF would be 1998 and 1999. So here he comes with Ed Ferrara, and you're thinking like, okay, it's going to be maybe it's going to be a more competitive game because WCW had the talent, to be competitive with WWF, but they just had a negative stigma. And just had been producing horrible television. I'm trying to remember. It was a pretty quick thing. I remember the first Russo show. I was impressed. I thought it was very good. And then the second show, I was kind of like, I don't know. Then they did the tournament for the vacant championship, where, whatever it was, like 30 matches, 31 matches, and it felt like every single match had outside interference. And in the middle of that tournament, it was kind of like, okay, I know this direction is not going to work. And I remember some people in WCW started to call me, and they go like, what do you think? What do you think? And I go, this direction is not going to work. And it's like, yeah, everyone's kind of saying that. They kind of figured out that he, his idea, was probably not going to work. And it actually, it actually got made, things solidified to a degree. For a little while, and because when Nash was booking, it was just this giant drop, and then with Russo, it kind of stayed stable. But it started, you could feel the crumbling of the foundation again, and by 2000, it was just, it really hit a bottom point in I think it was early 2000. Some of that was with there were a bunch of injuries, and of course the Radicals leaving, and that was a bad blow too. It was just all kinds of issues. When he wanted to make Tank Abbott world champion, it was kind of like, okay, that's an absolute disaster of an idea, which didn't happen.
Now, you mentioned Kevin Nash's booking reign. That was the beginning of 1999, and we ought to touch just briefly on that. Your overall assessment and recollection, your takeaway from Kevin Nash's period of control with the book.
Yeah, it's funny because for so long, and even after a little bit, but for so long, it was always like, who'd make a great booker is Kevin Nash. He's smart. He's up to date on everything. And then he became booker, and it was like the worst television I'd ever seen. It was all about, kind of like, 1970s sense of humor stuff and trying to reinvent wrestling. And, just all these things that it wasn't what that audience wanted. That audience, it really wasn't a difficult audience. I think all they really wanted was a good product, a good wrestling product, and I think that they just kept thinking that, oh, it's all about, shocking people, and it's all about just like like swerving and shocking. And it's like, no, they just want, the WCW audience was always the one where if you give them a good match, like just in that WCW environment, like the perfect example. They used to have they had a program for a while with Billy Kidman and Juventud Guerrera, and both guys, neither guy was pushed a lick. They were both considered like whatever, jobber material and everything. They put the two against each other, and they had phenomenal matches. They had great chemistry, and the matches would get over, or they would put the Mexican guys that they just buried, and those guys and put them in a 6-man where they just got to do their stuff, and it would get over. And so in WWF, I would watch the same type of thing where you would see these guys that were getting tryout matches that were really good, and the people would just sit there. You just have to understand. And Russo, I don't think understood the difference in the audience one bit. And that was really the problem. Is that Russo? I don't think he understood wrestling at all, but he had Vince McMahon to kind of. But he had a lot of creative ideas, and he had Vince McMahon to kind of like steer the ship. Without somebody steering the ship, he had no idea what he was doing, and it became very clear.
Well, just listening to what Vince Russo has said about the ways he thought his outlook on the business contrasted with the way WCW had done business, as well as Kevin Nash, who has been very disdainful in remarks over the years about the mentality of wrestling that they had when he arrived at WCW, even talking about things like the cadence of the referee's count and how different it is and slow it is in Georgia and how much less pop and speed and New York kind of grit and pace there is to it.
That's weird nitpicky stuff. That's like when that's like in TNA, just an example, when Hogan and Bischoff got all worked up over the 4-side ring versus the 6-side ring. And it's like, I don't really care which one you do. You should probably do the one that's safer for the wrestlers, which is the 4-sided ring. But the point is that like the fans, they just want a good product. They want stars against stars and things that book and make sense and these, worrying about like the minutia. I mean, WCW was on fire with those weird referee counts, and Southern wrestling was super popular with those referee counts. It's like, I mean, I would talk to guys, and it's like, oh, they didn't like the size of the ring, and it's like, I grew up watching wrestling in small rings and big rings, and if the talent's there, it works, and if the talent's having good matches, it works, and if the talent sucks, it doesn't matter the size of the ring. You know what I mean?
Well, less so than the minutia. Perhaps they were focused on minutia. I brought that up more to make the point that they were disdainful of what the WCW fan wanted, and they thought that wasn't a viable path forward in the 1999 pro wrestling.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember the whole thing of when they would always like beat the older regulars that had the Jim Crockett pedigree, the Four Horsemen type guys like the Ric Flairs, with the idea that these guys were never stars because they were playing in front of small crowds. And it's like, there was a period where they were not playing in front of small crowds, and then they were, they had bad management and they went down, just like when Vince had bad management and he went down. It's like, you have the dearth of the stars and you have bad booking or whatever and things aren't clicking. You go down, but it's not like, it's not like those weren't good cities or the fans weren't there if you did it right. The fans were, they were in cities, for all of the stuff of the WWF had certain advantages as far as, the population size of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, and some of the, even Baltimore and Washington. I mean, you compare that population-wise to like a Greensboro or a Charlotte or even Atlanta, although Atlanta was somewhat of a major city. Not somewhat, absolutely a major city. But the thing is like those guys, like if you compare per capita wrestling interest in Greensboro, North Carolina, and New York during the 1980s, Greensboro beats it hands down without any question. But New York, would New York draw bigger crowds? Yes, of course, because you have more population by far to draw from. But the point is, it's not saying New York is even worse. It's just saying what they did. They were very good at what they did, and it was very successful until it wasn't. Until you booked it out of success, and the idea that was the problem is the problem is hillbilly wrestling or whatever you want to call it. It's like that wasn't the issue. The issue is it's the issue it always is, making stars and making compelling programs and not not doing things that make your audience go, this is just not worth investing in because you have inconsistent storylines, or whatever it is that makes people stop watching. Whatever it is, because that's what they did. They stopped watching. And, Vince, one of the things with this period with WCW also is Vince really was clicking. He got, Steve Austin and The Rock at the same time. It can never be underestimated when you have, like there have been big stars historically, from Hogan to Bruno to Dusty and all that, Ric Flair. But to have The Rock and Stone Cold at the same time with that supporting cast with Mick Foley and Triple H and Shawn Michaels for a time, and then he wasn't there when it really took off, but and with them being so hot, it became one of those things where it was wrestling became the cool thing in that promotion. So they became the cool promotion. So you're fighting the cool promotion, with Mike Tyson and everything. So that's bad. And then to make it worse, you're desperate. And when you're desperate, you're making all kinds of mistakes out of desperation. If you look back at the stuff they did week in and week out, when Brian Alvarez wrote the book on the death of WCW, and I just, he redid it last year, and I was reading it on a flight, and then just looking, every week it was just like, it's like, oh yeah, now I remember it. It's like it really was worse than I remember, and I remember it being like this nightmarish thing where I kind of blocked like that whole period out of my mind because it was just so bad.
Now, was Vince Russo's departure from the WWF, did they sweat that at the WWF? Were they concerned that would be a game changer or a potential game changer?
If they did, they didn't tell me that. What I was told, by WWF at the time was that Ferrara wasn't that good. And I like Ed Ferrara, but Ferrara wasn't that good, and that Vince Russo would be something, but, the guy who turned the company around were Vince McMahon and Steve Austin, and then The Rock came along. And, it wasn't the writer, it was the stars. And then, the stars were larger than life. And the fact is like, of course, after he left, their biggest year was I think their best year WWF-wise was 2000. And their biggest money year of that era and profit year, if you take away, it would have been the biggest profit year except of the XFL debacle, but biggest wrestling profit year was 2001. This is after he's gone. Not saying that he didn't help build it, because he absolutely did. But it did get bigger, so his loss was not a calamity for that company because they kept the stars. And also he didn't help turn WCW around at all. WCW was in rough shape. I think it was salvageable, but it wasn't going to be easily salvageable. But what he did, it wasn't what what they were doing before. Absolutely wasn't what the people wanted. And then he came in, and I think that they did such a great job of marketing him coming in. Remember that first week he came in, and that rating was like, I forgot what it was, like a 3.6 or something, which was way up from what they had been doing. So it's like, wow, they got people to watch because of the writer, but which I thought, who would ever believe? But it didn't sustain, and and then the whole thing of like, blowing it up and starting over. I don't know that people want that. I think because it tells them everything they watched was fake. And I think that, like, we all know it is in wrestling, but that's not what the fan wants. The fan watching wrestling wants to believe, they don't believe in wrestling when they're talking about wrestling when the show's over. But when they're watching that 2 hours, they don't want it slapped in their face that everything they're watching is fake. That's not what they want, because, it's kind of like escapist. When you're watching, a movie, you don't want it slapped in your face that this movie isn't real, because then the movie loses whatever it's got. If you're watching, that's the thing that, and I think that's what Russo didn't understand at all, is that's what the fans wanted, was something that they could sink their teeth into, and make guys, and not all the bullshit finishes and everything like that, and the wacky, the characters that everyone knew weren't real characters, the over creative stuff. It didn't work. And it got, the 1999 run it did stabilize a little bit, but they were not going in the right direction. When he came back in 2000, after they took him away and then brought him back, that run was that whole year of 2000 was a freaking disaster.
No question. This show, Starrcade 1999, bit of a mess, sort of all over the place. It culminates in the tournament final. Bret Hart beats Goldberg to become champion. Roddy Piper calls for the bell and a recreation of the Montreal Screwjob finish, of course.
Yes.
Goldberg not.
Which, by the way, is something that I really believe that maybe after the Montreal finish, maybe the first time it was done afterwards, it may have worked. But, especially now where we're talking where, again, we have just seen the Montreal finish again. It's just like, I just think that every time you see it, you just go, oh, not again.
Incredible.
I don't think it's a good finish.
No. How did you feel at the time, if you recall? Bret puts Goldberg in the sharpshooter. Piper calls for the bell without Goldberg submitting. This was Russo's grand culmination of this tournament.
Yeah, I know. But the whole tournament was terrible. That was the problem. And they had all that talent. Like they still had. That was the one thing WCW had, is they had talent. But I remember, like, there was remember they had a Bret Hart, was it Bret Hart Chris Benoit match in Toronto?
Was the Owen Hart Memorial match.
Well, no, not the Owen Hart Memorial match. But this would have been, I don't remember if it was before or after.
Oh, that was Mayhem. Yeah, WCW Mayhem.
Right. Okay. So I remember watching that. And it's Bret Hart, Chris Benoit in Toronto, and they cut away to, like, all these shenanigans backstage and killed the whole match because they took the momentum away from, two of the best guys in the business, and they took their momentum away and they couldn't get it back. And I'm not saying they couldn't get it back. They got it back to a degree, but it was just like, you're gonna, like, cut to the back in the middle of. You know what I mean? It's like there's times if Mike Enos is wrestling and cut to the back, fine, go ahead. You know what I mean? But if you're main eventers and your stars are wrestling, don't cut to the back.
And this historic match, in a way, fateful for Bret Hart. This is the match where he absorbs the big head kick from Goldberg that causes a concussion. And
basically,
Dave, tell listeners about tell us all about what flowed downstream from there for the Hitman.
Yeah, everything was a disaster from there. So he got super kicked in the head. And, I remember watching this. I remember the kick going, that looked bad. But, you didn't really know it was going to be that bad. And it wasn't really, like, he continued to work because that's what they did in those days. And then it was, this was like end of December. So it was like, 2 weeks later or so, I remember hearing, it's like, he's kind of foggy and he's going to have to sit it out a little while. And the little while became the rest of his career for the most part. He never really, he did little stuff years later, but those weren't, but he was pretty much done. He was the first real concussion casualty of big names that we knew of. I don't remember anyone else. And he did. I remember, didn't he do the stunt where he did the driving on the ice and everything or whatever, which could have been a real disaster. This would have been because he did that with a concussion, and then he did the match with Terry Funk that I remember, where they did all those weapon shots to the head, which I'm sure did him no good.
Well, never forget, he fell out of Funk put him in like a pushable garbage container and kind of hit a skid, and Bret flipped out of the thing, landed right on his head on the floor. And I always remember that, probably compounding the Starrcade effect.
I think it all did. I believe, he had the one concussion, but I believe he had, like, the mini stuff by not resting the first concussion. And it's like the perfect example of why a boxer or an MMA fighter, when they have the concussion, have that no sparring rule for a while. It's like what he was doing by continuing to wrestle was he was essentially sparring after a knockout, and it's terrible for you.
Also at Starrcade, Chris Benoit beats Jeff Jarrett in a ladder match to become the Intercontinental Champion. Second from the top, of course, Benoit soon would be bolting.
U.S. champion.
Pardon me, yes, U.S. champion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would be bolting for WWF. Did this feel, as far as retaining Chris Benoit and keeping him interested in staying in WCW, feel like too little too late? Did they kind of have a rush at the end there to try to placate him, knowing that he had his eye on the WWF?
Well, I think the world title thing was a way to do that when he won the title, was it in January of 2000?
Just the next month.
Yeah, the next month. At this point, it was weird because there was really no, the whole thing of, everyone was frustrated. Just because the company was doing bad, and those guys, like Benoit and everything, they'd been there for years and years and years, and they would always be pushed to a certain level, but never to this top level. And they were, so everyone's frustrated because their belief was them and their buddies are the best wrestlers in the company, which they were, but somehow we're below these guys and not getting a chance to be with them. So, but you had that, but I don't think that would have come to a head. Would the whole reason that whole thing fell apart, and I know because I was on the phone with those guys when it was going on, is, you could take it two ways, but it was when Russo got replaced, they went to Kevin Sullivan, and Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit had the terrible heat because Chris Benoit was, I don't know if he was married yet, but he was with, Kevin's ex-wife, and felt that Kevin was going to bury him. So Kevin, the first thing Kevin does is make him world champion, feeling that would, but they went to management and they just were, if Kevin's the booker, we all want to quit. And so they made Benoit world champion, figuring that, hey, if we make him world champion, he won't quit. But it didn't mean anything to him. So that's where they lost it. So, but in December at the Starrcade, Russo, I believe, was still Russo was still the booker. So there was really no issues at the time because the Russo thing fell apart when he wanted to put Abbott over in that battle royal, which we talked about, and that was like a couple weeks later, and that was when Brett.
Right.
And who was the other one? Jarrett had a concussion too, right?
I believe so, and I think Goldberg put his hand through the window, didn't he? In early 2000.
I'm trying to remember what it was. I feel that the hand through the window was right around that same time. Yeah. Yeah,
it certainly didn't happen before Starrcade '99 because
right, because he was in it. Yeah. It was.
Now,
would have been right. So Jarrett took a Superfly splash off a cage, I believe, from Snuka,
right,
and got a
Thunder.
concussion. And he was he was Russo's guy, so he probably would have been world champion. He was not even would have. He would have been world champion. Brett obviously was going to be the world champion for a while. So that was so both Brett and Jarrett are gone. So then the idea is okay. We had this battle royal, right? And Abbott was going to win the battle royal, and somehow I don't remember what happened there. Benoit beat Sid Vicious with the foot on the ropes or something, and then Benoit went and the very next day went and quit.
Mm-hmm.
So so it's like everything went wrong. And then when Benoit and those guys, when Eddie Guerrero and Malenko and Perry Saturn, when they left, I think that's when the heart was really torn out of the company because it was like, okay, now. Before you always could say that well, we got these guys that are the best wrestlers in the world, and now they're there too. And so what do we have left? We've got Hogan and Ric Flair and those guys that were the greatest in their day, but we needed somebody else on top. It was that day was over.
Also at Starrcade '99 in the ring is David Flair, a short-lived run for the son of the Nature Boy. What do you make, Dave, of David Flair's run in WCW and in pro wrestling?
There's a lot of ways to look at it. I mean, number one, the worst thing they ever did was rush him. I mean, he should have been trained. He either should have been a pro wrestler and started from scratch, because it's like, I just would think that like David Flair in Charlotte, North Carolina, the son of Ric Flair, like there should be something. And David really didn't have a lot of charisma, which hurt, especially when your last name is Flair. But he was put on the roster, way, way, way too early, and put in kind of a position of kind of like it's like it was a role of like we'll beat him up to make fun of Rick. The role was never right. He wasn't very good, but again, I never thought that was his fault, because he was thrown in there too quick. So it wasn't a success. I always thought, maybe, but then, David just, it's funny because David really didn't have a lot of charisma. So I don't know that, when I think back, maybe he was like Kelly Kiniski, if you know what I mean, in the sense of, even if he was a good wrestler, he just didn't have the charisma, and the name isn't going to help you at that point. And I don't want to say it hurt him, because it probably actually did help him, but in other ways it shined a bigger light on him, if you know what I mean.
Sure. Finally, on Starrcade '99, also in action on the card, Creative Control, Ron and Don Harris, good friends of Jeff Jarrett and Russo, but the idea of Creative Control as being a greenlit concept for television. Tell us, Dave, about Creative Control, what that buzzword meant in the Russo era, and what it said about the booking mentality that they would get a tag team on television called Creative Control.
Well, there was just everything like that, and they're just, like they would go, oh, well, they're handcuffing us because we can't, like we can't call somebody fat, or we can't do this. It's like, that's not what wrestling is. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, we can't swear. It's like, wrestling's been around a million years, and people, again, sometimes when people swore it worked, and sometimes it didn't. But there plenty of times nobody would swear, and wrestling was just fine. It's like they it was a crutch, And again, granted, going with Vince, Vince did have very edgy product, so it did make it tough. But but what the thing was is Vince had the dynamic personalities on top, and these guys had the older guys and the crappy product.